This video series is about a story. This story is about people from a particular religious group who thought they were persecuted. To escape, a large number of them made a dangerous journey across a sea, a trip that some even describe as miraculous. However, when they reached the other side, they had to learn to survive in a harsh wilderness. Nevertheless, they became a great people who believed they had received special blessings because they made a covenant with God. Oops, I'm so sorry. Wow, this is embarrassing. Um, those were the wrong slides. So I guess I'll go back to the beginning and start again. Sorry about that. This story is about people from a particular religious group who thought they were persecuted. To escape, a large number of them made a dangerous journey across a sea, a trip that some even describe as miraculous. However, when they reached the other side, they had to learn to survive in a harsh wilderness. Nevertheless, they became a great people who believed they had received special blessings because they made a covenant with God. Hi, this is Richard Rogers, and welcome to the first installment of my series on Christian nationalism. This video handles introductory topics for the series. I will define Christian nationalism. I will discuss some issues to which we must be sensitive in the discussion of Christian nationalism, and I will present the outline for this series. To understand Christian nationalism, let's take on a more general question. What is nationalism? If I were to ask you if you were a nationalist, you'd probably hem and haw a bit and then say something like, well, I guess I am. I love my country. After that, you would give me a list of things that you do in support of that statement. In political science and sociology, we do not call that nationalism. That's a fairly standard experience everywhere, fairly normal for people to love their country, to have some sort of identification with the place where they live, and to show some sort of affection for the people with whom they associate. A more technical definition of nationalism is here. Nationalism can be described as the resistance to the formation of the modern nation state and its consequences. This resistance is the result of grievances that people have. And those grievances are pretty common across all nationalist groups. So there'll be complaints about the government bureaucracy, about its regulations, and the perception that it's corrupt. There'll be concerns about impingements on personal freedoms that come from a centralized government apparatus setting regulations. And most nation states include within their borders multiple cultural groups. And there are issues about how these groups can live side by side. So in nationalism, there's a lot of discussion about diversity and the problems that the country is having because of this. Now you'll notice in my definition, I have in parentheses the word populist. A lot of political scientists and sociologists do associate nationalism with populism, but I decided not to do so. When we look at a lot of groups that get labeled nationalist, many of them are actually a handful of people who are fringe groups in their society. So it would be correct to say that they're nationalist, but it would be wrong to say that they're populist. However, when nationalism gets our attention, it's usually because there is some sort of populist movement. And Christian nationalism is a kind of a populist nationalist movement. So that's why it gets our attention. There are many different kinds of nationalism, And the kind that we're dealing with in this series could be labeled cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism is the claim of a group of people over a country's institutions, culture, and heritage to the exclusion of the contributions of other groups of people. In the United States, cultural nationalism describes our national heritage as white, European, sometimes they might use the word English, and Christian. And there we have a variety of terms as well, depending on whether one wants to broaden the concept of Christian to include the whole of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or whether one wants to narrow it and focus primarily on Protestants or evangelicals. As a result of this, we have the definition here at the bottom. Christian nationalism focuses on the third bullet point, that the United States is the product of a Christian heritage. Now, we will, over the course of this series, see how some other themes about whiteness and European origin have also entered the Christian nationalist movement, but one can be a Christian nationalist without holding the other 2 points. Our formal definition of Christian nationalism is as follows: the claim of Christians over American institutions, culture, and heritage to the exclusion of the contributions of other groups of people. Sometimes formal definitions don't make sense. So when we try to define something for the first time, it's often helpful to say, what is the thing not? So let's look at Christian nationalism and say, what is it not? Well, it's not patriotism. Christian nationalism can include patriotism, but it is not synonymous with patriotism. Christian nationalism also is not American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States has played a unique and leading role in the formation of the modern world by introducing globally certain ideas and institutions. In particular, we tend to focus on democracy and free markets as areas in which the United States has made unique contributions. American exceptionalism is a controversial idea, to be sure. There are some big blots on our national character that come from the treatment of Native Americans and from the institution of slavery. As a result, some people might claim that Christian nationalism and American exceptionalism are synonymous. And I certainly understand that argument, but there's also another argument made by some American exceptionalists that the United States is a work in progress. So we shouldn't be judged by the standard of perfection, but we should be judged by whether or not we are moving toward that standard. Presidential historian John Meacham is an example of someone who holds to this work in progress form of American exceptionalism. In his book, The Soul of America, subtitled The Battle for Our Better Angels, Meacham declares that in certain national crises, the president, rather than following short-term political interests, has reached deep into the value system of the country and made decisions that are in the nation's long-term interests and show our progress towards certain goals, such as the inclusion of all Americans equally within our society. Finally, Christian nationalism is not a conspiracy theory. Normally, a statement like that would not be made in a presentation on Christian nationalism, but I am making this after the Stop the Steal movement and the January 6th Capitol riot. With both, we see Christian nationalists embracing conspiracy theories. I just want to make it clear that one can be a Christian nationalist without holding to these ideas. So we'll be dealing with them in this presentation series, but again, keep in mind Christian nationalism itself is something that's much broader. It's fairly easy to construct a good working definition of Christian nationalism. But as we look at some specific manifestations of it, there are some issues to which we need to be sensitive. First, Christian nationalism builds on a set of ideas that are widely diffuse in our culture. Just because a person holds to a specific idea does not necessarily mean that they are a Christian nationalist. Instead, what we need to be looking at is how these ideas are combined and also then used to mobilize people to action. Second, within its ranks, Christian nationalism varies in the acceptance of some ideas by degree or level. For example, let's take the notion of spiritual warfare. There are some within the Christian nationalist movement who emphasize the spiritual side of this. There are others who emphasize warfare. We saw that in the January 6th Capitol riot, in which people were using spiritual warfare to justify acts of violence. Finally, Christian nationalism is only one part of its adherents' ideology. In fact, Christian nationalists themselves rarely describe themselves in this way. It's a term that's often used by journalists and academics. It's important to understand this because when we isolate the beliefs and practices of Christian nationalism and separate them from the broader practices of the communities that hold these beliefs, we often get the misunderstanding that these are angry, bitter people. Social researchers who have looked at these communities often find that the adherents of Christian nationalism and other conservative points of view are people who are normal, nice, concerned about their family and their community. You'd probably want some of them living next door if you have bad neighbors now. So all three of these issues, let's be sensitive to them as we move forward. About this series. I am projecting this to be 14 installments with an installment about every 2 weeks. If I can do it faster, I will, because to carry this out for 28 weeks is a long time. But I also am trying to be practical in terms of expectations, and am trying to keep in mind that I have a variety of other things that I have to accomplish. Second, this series is going to be basic yet comprehensive. So it's going to be comprehensive in the sense that I'm going to try to address a lot of the main topics that come up in the discussion of what is Christian nationalism and what's happening in Christian nationalism today. At the same time, we're not going to drill deep. This series really is intended to be introductory in nature. For the benefit of those who want to drill deeper, I will have some recommended readings. They will be placed on my personal website, rogersperspectives.com, and you should look under the commentary tab. Third, I don't just want to criticize Christian nationalism. There are plenty of writings already in the marketplace where people do just that. As I mentioned, Christian nationalism is only one part of the ideology of the communities that hold these beliefs. And I think it's important that we try to understand why people who are otherwise nice and normal would hold some views that many of us think are extreme. So we will attempt to do that from time to time in this series. Finally, we will engage in some theological reflection. If the path forward for our society is not Christian nationalism, then what is it? And we'll be looking at that issue specifically from a Christian perspective towards the end of this series. Here's how we're going to accomplish all of this. So right here I have the plans laid out for the 14 parts. We're obviously on part 1 today. The next part will have to do with religious and theological beliefs of Christian nationalism. We're going to start with the question, is the United States a Christian nation? And we're going to look at both sides of that debate. And then in part 3 and part 4, we'll look at specific theological concepts that have found their way into the Christian nationalist movement. There are a number of social problems and policy issues where Christian nationalism has taken positions either intentionally or unintentionally, and we're going to look at some of those in parts 5 through 8. We're going to get into the political aspects of Christian nationalism in parts 9 through 11. And that includes looking at the organizational structure of the Christian right and how that affects Christian nationalism. In part 10, we will be looking at the formation of ideological coalitions among Christian nationalists, neo-Nazis, and groups like the KKK and Proud Boys. And finally, we're going to look at this question that's really critical in our time, and that is, why are Christian nationalists arguing for authoritarianism and adopting anti-democratic beliefs and practices? The final part of this series is when we are going to start making some Christian reflection on the subject of Christian nationalism. We'll look at what Scripture has to say about living in a diverse culture. We'll look at how early Christians talked about their relationship with government, and then we'll make some concluding remarks about the path forward. As you can probably tell from this introductory presentation, this series is going to look a lot like a lecture. I guess that makes sense because I'm a college professor. If you're looking for something that's really slick and entertaining, you'll probably not find it here. I'm not going to have fancy lighting. There's not going to be any really high-produced video material. It's just me with my laptop camera, a microphone, and some PowerPoint slides. On the other hand, I hope you find this series educational, and it provides an opportunity to reflect on the place of Christians in modern American society. I hope that you tune in and watch additional installments in this series. Thank you.